The Steelers cut down the roster this week, Riley. Not a lot of surprises. The team released punter Cam Johnston, who was on a 3-year deal but got hurt last season. Robert Woods, who just isn't that 1,000-yard receiver he was with the Rams. And Beanie Bishop, who was a starter a season ago. Riley, Bishop and many of those guys already back with the team on the practice squad. So what were kind of your initial thoughts about how this 53-man shaped out?
Yeah, and I'll go based off of what Mike Tomlin said, because he really liked this 90-man group that the Steelers have put together heading into training camp. And you could just kind of tell that there were a lot of tough roster battles at the end of this roster here, because 16 of those guys that they ended up cutting ended up back on that team's practice squad there. So that's a good sign that you liked a lot of the guys and that they were in on some tough competitions like James Pierre and Beanie Bishop.
James Pierre and Beanie Bishop, both those guys you just said, played huge roles last year. What's your, now they're in the practice squad, are you surprised they put that much experience in that position?
Well, and Beanie Bishop's the more interesting one here because he started last year for the team, but then his playing time really diminished whenever Cam Sutton returned from suspension. But Bishop did shine a little bit too, 4 interceptions, 2 in that game against the Jets against Aaron Rodgers. So that was the biggest shock for me.
Real quick, yes or no, the team has the depth and skill it needs at safety?
I don't think so right now, but that could change depending on how much safety Jalen Ramsey will play.
Well, we're going to turn this over to Ryan and Brian Batko here in a second, but Riley, you're our trivia question guy, and I got one for you. Aaron Rodgers has played in a lot of football games and won a lot of them, but he's never beaten one team. Which is it? Here are your 4 options: Packers, Steelers, Jets, Texans. We'll have the answer coming up later in the show. But for now, let's hand this over to Ryan Riskey, who's sitting down with the Post-Gazette's Brian Batko.
All right, we welcome Brian Batko from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette onto Black and Gold today. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. I guess first things first, what do you think is the realistic outlook and expectations for the Steelers this season?
Well, Ryan, I mean, it's hard for me to really predict much, above or below what we've seen from them so often in recent years, kind of that 10-7 mark that I feel like I always just instinctively say for the Steelers. And it's funny, some people will hear that and say, wow, that's so pessimistic of you. And others might hear that and say, that's so optimistic of you. It really is kind of a litmus test here for what people think of Aaron Rodgers and the moves that this team made. And that's the one that I think gets thrown out there a lot is, how can you say they're not going to be improved when you've improved the quarterback position from Russell Wilson and Justin Fields to Aaron Rodgers? But I remember this time a year ago where people were saying, well, they won 10 games with Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, and Mason Rudolph. Surely they can do better than that with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. And as we saw down the stretch last season, things fell apart and they did not. So I'm just going to have to see it to believe it from this club.
And I guess, what do you expect from the offense this year? Because obviously going from Justin Fields and Russell Wilson on paper to Aaron Rodgers sounds like a big upgrade, except I think there's still some unknowns, especially with Rodgers being 41 years old and how last season went with the Jets.
And we didn't see him at all in preseason action. So unless you were out there at St. Vincent College in Latrobe, like we were at times this summer, or you got one of those invites to the behind closed doors joint practice with the Bucs at Acrisure Stadium, you really haven't seen him work with DK Metcalf and Pat Freiermuth, Calvin Austin, Roman Wilson, Jonnu Smith. A few of those guys who I just mentioned were banged up themselves and missing some practice time. So, I mean, clearly, Ryan, this was a summer for the offensive line to try to gel and coalesce as a unit. Although I'll also say, again, coming back to the availability aspect of this, left guard Isaac Seumalo, by far the most experienced and accomplished member of the group, was out for a lot of camp. So even that first 5 is still trying to play catch up and get on the same page a little bit here leading up to week 1. So I think that the offense does have a higher ceiling than it has in recent years for sure, especially Rodgers being able to use the middle of the field, see things pre-snap, change a play, and then maybe above all else, just having a guy out there like DK Metcalf to throw it to. I think he's somebody who gives you even more game-breaking ability than a George Pickens did.
I think kind of one of the bigger question marks they have is the number 2 wide receiver position, at least coming into training camp, except then Roman Wilson looked really good in camp and in the preseason. So, who do you think fills that number 2 role?
I think by the end of the season, Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson will be pretty close in receptions and catches Roman Wilson to me was someone who, I don't want to say he lit it up in training camp or the preseason, but I think he helped himself. I think he gained some confidence after that lost rookie season because of injury. Calvin Austin broke out to some extent last season, and then he was on the shelf for much of camp this year with an oblique issue of some sort. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a by committee approach. I think Aaron Rodgers trusts both of those guys. They've both got speed to burn opposing defensive backs. So I think it'll be situational that you see them. Neither one of them might be in the top 3 of targets on this team when you look at the tight ends and even some of the running backs catching passes. So they might be down the NFL list of number 2 receiver production, but really the big thing for them is just making the most of their opportunities when they're called upon.
All right, he's Brian Batko, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Brian, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll be right back after a quick break. You're watching Black and Gold Today.